The hall was enormous. It was so large that the ceiling could not be seen from the floor. Lights floated in the air like slow stars, and the walls were made of dark glass that showed the open universe outside. Billions of stars, distant and cold and indifferent. The Galactic Concordat Council Chamber had been built 500 years ago, and it had been designed to make everyone inside it feel small. It worked. Ambassador Alara Kovacs of Earth stood at the long curved table and looked around the room. There were representatives from over 200 species sitting in their seats. Tall ones, short ones, ones with too many eyes, ones with no eyes at all. Some breathed air that was different from hers. Some communicated through devices that translated sounds into words she could understand. But they were all here, all looking at her, all waiting. She had been an ambassador for 11 years. She was good at her job. She believed in what she was doing. Beside her sat Admiral Sarah Vance. The Admiral was a tall woman with short gray hair and dark eyes that missed very little. She wore her uniform neatly, the way she always did. She was not the kind of person who got nervous in rooms full of aliens. She had fought in 3 border conflicts before humanity even joined the Concordat. She had seen things that most people would never see. But sitting in that room that day, listening to the council's proposal being read aloud, she felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt uneasy. The proposal was being read by Councillor Dreth Voss, the senior representative of the Velhari people, one of the oldest and most respected species in the Concordat. He was a tall creature, thin and pale, with 4 long fingers on each hand, and a voice that was smooth and slow, and carried across the hall without effort. He spoke the way old politicians always spoke. Like everything he said was reasonable, like disagreement would be childish. The proposal was called the Unified Disarmament and Trust Accord. It was a long name for a simple idea. The idea was this: Earth, as a new member of the Concordat, would give its primary war fleet, all 2,400 ships of the Iron Covenant Armada, to the Concordat for redistribution. The ships would be used as part of a new joint peacekeeping force. Earth soldiers would serve on those ships under Concordat command, not Earth command. In return, Earth would receive a permanent seat on the Security Circle, which was the most powerful decision-making body in the Concordat. Earth would also receive faster access to trade routes, medical technology, and construction support. It sounded like a good deal. That was what made Admiral Vance uneasy. She leaned close to Ambassador Kovacs and spoke quietly. "Ilara, this is not a good deal." Kovacs looked at her. "The Security Circle seat alone is worth 10 fleets. We've been trying to get that for 20 years. "I know," Vance said. "That's what bothers me. Why are they offering it now? What changed?" Kovacs paused. She was a careful woman. She didn't dismiss things easily. The political climate has shifted. The Keth expansion in the outer sectors has made the elder races nervous. They want to look unified. Bringing Earth fully into the fold is a visible gesture. Or they want our fleet out of our hands before we become too strong to manage, Vance said. Kovacs looked at her for a long moment. "Sarah, we've been members for 30 years. They've treated us well. They've tolerated us," Vance said. "There's a difference." But the vote was not Vance's to make. She was military. Her job was to advise, not to decide. The decision belonged to Ambassador Kovacs and, ultimately, to the government back on Earth. And back on Earth, the Parliament had already been briefed. The Prime Minister had already expressed support. The people of Earth, tired of decades of cautious half-membership, wanted the full seat at the table. They wanted to matter. Drethvos finished reading. The chamber was quiet. Ambassador Kovacs stood. "The people of Earth," she said, "are proud to accept this accord. We have always believed in cooperation over conflict. We have always believed that trust, once built carefully, leads to a better galaxy for all of us. Today we take another step in that direction." The chamber filled with a sound that the translation devices rendered as applause, though it came in many different forms. Clicking, humming, low tones, the rustling of membranes, 200 species showing approval. Vance sat very still and watched Kovacs sign the document. She watched the pen move across the paper. Actual paper, because the Concordat liked ceremony. And she felt the unease in her chest grow heavier. She couldn't point to a specific fact. She had no evidence. She had only 30 years of studying how power worked, and the quiet, a persistent feeling that nobody gave away a seat at the table without a reason. After the signing, there was a reception. Alien diplomats came to congratulate Kovacs. They were warm and gracious. Several of them told her that Earth had shown great wisdom. One elderly representative from the Nahari people, a round four-armed species with soft voices, took Kovacs' hand and held it for a moment and said, "This is a historic day. You should be proud." Vance stood near the edge of the room and drank something that tasted like cold mineral water and watched everyone carefully. A voice spoke beside her. "You do not look like someone at a celebration." She turned. It was a Volhari, one of the smaller species in the Concordat, insectoid in shape, with large amber eyes and a body that moved in quick, precise motions. His name was Keth Aaron, and he was a junior trade representative. Vance had spoken to him twice before. He was young for his kind, curious, and unusually direct. "I'm not sure there's much to celebrate yet," she said. Keth Aaron tilted his head. His amber eyes moved across the room slowly. "The senior counselors are very pleased tonight," he said quietly. "More pleased than I would expect from a simple trade agreement." Vance looked at him. "Is that what you think this is?" "I think," he said very carefully, "that the Iron Covenant Armada is the largest non-concordat military force in this sector. I think that has made certain elder species nervous for a long time. And I think that some problems are easier to solve with paperwork than with war." He said nothing more. He moved away into the crowd, his small body disappearing between taller figures. Aunt Vance set down her drink. She went back to her quarters that night and sat at her desk and wrote a long message to Earth's Department of Military Affairs. She outlined her concerns. She asked for a delay in the physical handover of the fleet. She asked for additional review of the Accord's language. She asked, in plain words, whether anyone had considered that this might be a trap. The reply came 2 days later. It was polite. It acknowledged her concerns. It told her that her service to Earth was valued and that her perspective had been noted. It told her that the handover would proceed as scheduled. She read the message 3 times. Then she deleted it and began preparing the handover logistics. The Iron Covenant Armada was the pride of humanity's military. It had been built over 40 years of careful construction, upgraded constantly, and crewed by the best soldiers and pilots Earth could produce. Its flagship, the ESNS Resolve, was one of the most advanced warships in known space. The fleet had never lost a major engagement. It had kept Earth safe during the difficult early years of Concordat membership, when other species still tested humanity's boundaries and wondered how far they could push before being pushed back. The crews were told they were being reassigned to joint peacekeeping duties. Most of them accepted this with the kind of quiet professionalism that military people tend to show when they are given orders they didn't ask for. Some were unhappy. A few veterans asked questions that were answered with the words diplomatic necessity. Captain Darren Holt, commander of the ESNS Resolve, sat in his captain's chair on the day the fleet departed Earth's orbital space and looked out at the stars through the forward viewport. He was 51 years old. He had served on this ship for 12 years. He ran his hand along the arm of his chair once, slowly, the way people touch things they're saying goodbye to without admitting it. "All ships report ready, Captain," his navigation officer said. "Acknowledged," he said. "Take us out." The Iron Covenant Armada moved, 2,400 ships in perfect formation, sliding away from Earth and her moons and her orbital stations, moving out into the dark between stars. People on Earth watched from observation decks and from windows and from public screens in city squares. They waved, though the ships were already too far away to see any individual. They were proud, and they had done something mature and brave and trusting. Admiral Vance watched from a Concordat transport ship that was traveling alongside the Armada. She was there in an official capacity as Earth's senior military liaison during the handover. She watched the ships move and said nothing. The Concordat escort fleet, 40 ships, all large, all bearing the Concordat's crest of interlocking circles, formed up around the Armada and guided it toward the transfer point in the Selhara system, 3 jumps from Earth. The journey took 9 days. During those 9 days, Vance reviewed the transfer documentation again and again. She looked for legal loopholes. She looked for terms that could be reinterpreted. She drafted several requests to delay the final handover, citing procedural technicalities, and each one was gently but firmly declined by Concordat administrators. On the ninth day, the Armada arrived at Selhara Station, a Concordat military installation the size of a small moon. It was surrounded by more Concordat ships than Vance had ever seen in one place. Hundreds of them, maybe more. She stood at the viewport of her transport and looked at them. "That's not a reception fleet," she said to herself. "That's a cage." But it was too late. The transfer documents had been signed. The Armada's command codes had already been submitted to Concordat authority as part of the accord terms. Captain Holt and his crew were technically guests now, not commanders. The 2,400 ships of the Iron Covenant Armada docked at Selhara Station. And then the communications started going wrong. It was small at first, a channel going quiet. A scheduled update from Captain Holt that didn't arrive. A status report from one of the Armada's destroyer squadrons that came back, garbled and then stopped completely. Vance reported these issues to Concordat Station Command and was told politely that there were routine technical difficulties during integration procedures. She asked to speak to Captain Holt directly. She was told he was in a briefing. She asked again. She was told he was unavailable. She asked a third time, and this time no one answered at all. She stood in the communications room of her transport with her hands very still at her sides and understood, in that moment, with the kind of cold and absolute clarity that only comes when something you feared turns out to be true, that the unease she had carried for weeks was not paranoia. It was a warning she had not been allowed to act on. She turned to her aide, a young lieutenant named Prell, who had been with her for 3 years, and said in a voice that was very calm and very quiet, "Get me a direct line to Earth. Secure channel. Right now." Prell moved fast. He was good at his job. He knew when the Admiral's voice meant urgency. The channel opened. Static. Then the sound of Earth military command frequency. "This is Admiral Sarah Vance," she said. "I need to speak to the Chief of Defense. Priority 1. Something has gone wrong." Outside the viewport, Selhara Station was silent. The 2,400 ships of the Iron Covenant Armada sat inside its docking rings and did not move. No lights blinked from their hulls. No communications came from their crews. The stars beyond were cold and distant and did not offer any answers. Earth did not yet know what had been done, but Admiral Vance knew, and she was already thinking about what came next. It was a small ship, an independent freighter that ran supply routes between the outer colony stations, and its captain had picked up a faint distress broadcast while passing through the Helvara Drift, a wide stretch of empty space between 2 relay beacons. The signal was weak, broken, repeating on an emergency military frequency that civilian ships weren't supposed to receive. But the captain had old military-grade receivers fitted to his ship, left over from a time when the routes out there were less safe, and the signal came through clearly enough to understand. It was a human voice. It was saying in a flat and exhausted tone that life support was at 11% and falling, or that they had been drifting for 6 days and that they needed help. The freighter captain, a man named Goran Ash, who had never served in the military but had 2 brothers who had, changed course without thinking about it. He followed the signal for 4 hours. What he found made him sit very still in his captain's chair for a long time before he could make himself speak. There were 9 warships drifting in the dark. They were human ships. He could see the Earth Naval Service markings on their hulls, faded but visible. They were Iron Covenant Armada ships. They had been stripped. Their weapon systems had been removed. Their engine cores had been pulled out and replaced with nothing. Their communications arrays had been dismantled down to the raw wiring. The ships were hollow shells, and inside those shells were human crews with no food left, water running out, and air that was getting thinner by the hour. He got as many people aboard his freighter as he could. He called every ship he knew in the region on open frequency and told them what he had found. He sent the coordinates to every relay beacon in range. He did not stop to think about politics or procedure. He just started moving people. By the time a proper rescue convoy arrived 2 days later, 43 people from those 9 ships had died. The rest were alive, barely. And when they were brought onto rescue ships and given air and water and food, many of them didn't speak. They just sat and breathed. That was the first signal. Over the next 2 weeks, more came. They came from across a dozen star systems, broken broadcasts, emergency beacons, frantic messages tapped out on low-power transmitters by crews who had cannibalized their own ship systems just to send a signal. Everywhere the story was the same. Iron Covenant Armada ships, stripped and abandoned. Human crews left to die in the dark. Some had been drifting for weeks already. Some were beyond saving by the time rescue arrived. Others were found just in time. The number of dead grew every day. Back on Earth, the news hit like something physical. People stopped in the middle of their daily lives, in offices, in markets, in schools, and stared at screens showing the same images. Gaunt, hollow-eyed soldiers being carried off rescue ships, speaking in quiet voices about what had happened to them. Children recognizing parents they had not heard from in weeks. Military families who had been told their relatives were on reassignment, learning that their relatives had been dying in cold ships for the same amount of time. The Parliament convened in an emergency session. The Defense Ministry released a statement saying they were gathering information and could not yet confirm the full scope of events. Several ministers who had voted in favor of the disarmament accord did not appear publicly for several days. Ambassador Kovacs resigned on the 12th day. She sent a short written statement. It did not have many words in it. It said that she had acted in good faith and that she was deeply sorry and that she would carry what had happened for the rest of her life. She did not appear on any screens. She did not give any interviews. People who knew her said she had gone very quiet and very still, with the way someone does when a weight has been placed on them that they know they will never fully put down. Admiral Vance was not quiet. She had been moved to a secure facility on Titan, one of Saturn's moons, far from concordate space. The moment it became clear she was not going to stay in her assigned quarters at Selhara. She had, in fact, spent 3 days demanding access to Captain Holt and the other crews before Concordat security personnel had politely but firmly suggested she board a transport back to human space. She had gone because fighting her way out of a Concordat installation with no weapons and one aide was not a useful strategy. But she had not stopped working. She had been sending messages since before she left Selhara, to the Defense Ministry, to the Prime Minister's office, to military intelligence, to retired officers she trusted, to anyone who would listen. Her messages were detailed and specific. She had dates, names, timeline discrepancies. She had noticed in the transfer documentation language that gave the Concordat full authority over the crews, not just the ships, during what they called the integration period. It was buried deep in a subsection that nobody had flagged during the review. She had found it herself on the 9th day of travel to Sahara, too late to matter then, but documented now. She sat in a small office on Titan's military base and worked 18 hours a day and slept 4 hours a night and drank too much coffee and moved with the focused energy of someone who had decided very clearly what needed to be done and was working backwards from that decision. On the 17th day after the first signal, Yuri the document arrived. It came through Ketharan, the young Volhari trade representative she had spoken to briefly at the reception. He had sent it through 3 layers of encrypted civilian channels, routed through relay stations in 2 different neutral systems, attached to what looked like a routine commercial shipment manifest. It arrived on Vance's personal terminal as a file labeled Cargo Specifications, Routine Update. She almost deleted it. Her aide Prell had better instincts and opened it instead. Inside was a concordant internal administrative document. It was dated 14 months ago. It had been produced by something called the Long-Term Strategic Stability Subcommittee, which sounded boring and routine and was, in fact. Yet the Concordat Security Circle's private planning body, the one that made decisions that were never meant to be seen by anyone outside the Elder Race's inner circle. The document was 47 pages long. Vance read all of it in one sitting. When she finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. The document was not subtle now that it was in front of her. It outlined in the careful, neutral language that bureaucracies use to describe terrible things. A long-standing concern among the Concordat's senior species. The concern was humanity, specifically what humanity might become. The Elder Races had been watching Earth for 3 decades. They had watched humans adapt to space faster than expected. And they had watched human technology improve in ways that the Concordat's own scientists found difficult to predict. They had watched human soldiers prove effective in conflicts where other species' forces had struggled. They had watched the Iron Covenant Armada grow from a small defensive force into something that genuinely concerned the Concordate's military analysts. And they had watched humans breed. Humans were, by galactic standards, extraordinarily prolific. Their population had expanded significantly even in the 30 years of Concordate membership. Their colonies were growing. Their industrial output was increasing. In 200 years, a short time by galactic standards, humanity could become a major power. The document called this a stability risk. It described several possible approaches to managing this risk. As the final approach, the one that had been selected was labeled peaceful capacity reduction through diplomatic mechanism, which meant, in plain language, get humanity to give up its fleet voluntarily through a deal that looked generous before it became too strong to manage without a fight. The security circle seat offered to Earth was real, the document noted, but it was a ceremonial seat with no actual voting power on military matters. The language was in the fine print. Nobody had checked the fine print carefully enough. The document also noted, in a section that Vance read 3 times to make sure she was understanding it correctly, that the Iron Covenant Armada's crews had been considered a secondary concern. The ships were the target. The crews were logistical byproduct. Their disposal was left to the discretion of the on-site commander at Selhara Station. That on-site commander had apparently decided that releasing 300,000 trained human soldiers back to Earth, angry and experienced and aware of what had happened to them, was not a good idea. So he had left them in the ships and stripped the ships and moved on. Vance folded her hands on the desk and held them very still. Her face did not change. She had learned a long time ago how to feel enormous things without showing them on her face. Because there were times when the people around you needed to see steadiness more than they needed to see truth. Prell was standing near the door. He had read the document over her shoulder. When he was 26 years old, and this was the worst thing he had ever seen, and it showed on his face very clearly. "Admiral," he said. His voice was careful. "Get me a secure line to the Prime Minister," she said. "Direct. No intermediaries." "Yes, Admiral." And Prell, "Ma'am, send a copy of this document to every news organization on Earth. Everyone, all at once." He looked at her. "That will—" "Yep," she said. "I know what it will do. Send it." He sent it. Within 6 hours, the document was everywhere. It was on every screen, every terminal, every personal device on Earth, and every human colony. People read it standing in the street. People read it at work and stopped working. People who had lost family members in the abandoned ships read it and went very quiet for a very long time, and then were not quiet at all. What the reaction was not grief. Grief had already happened. This was something else, something harder and colder and more purposeful. The kind of feeling that does not cry, the kind that starts making plans. The Prime Minister went on the public broadcast. He was a careful man, not given to strong words, but his voice was different that night. "What was done to our people," he said, "was not an accident. It was not a misunderstanding. It was a deliberate act by those who called themselves our allies, carried out against soldiers who had done nothing wrong except belong to a species that other people decided was becoming too powerful." He paused. "We will respond." In the outer systems, the 12 star systems where Iron Covenant crews had been stranded, something was already happening without anyone's instruction. The surviving crews, when the ones who had been found and were alive and had been given working ships by rescue convoys, had been given one directive by Earth Command: come home. They were moving. Some of them were moving in small groups of 2 or 3 ships, some alone. All of them were broadcasting on open military frequency as they traveled. One short message repeated without stop: "We are coming home." The broadcast spread across the galaxy. Alien species in a dozen systems picked up the signal. Some of them listened to it and felt nothing. Some of them felt something they did not quite have words for. The Volhari listened, and Ketharan, sitting at his desk on a station in neutral space, put his 4-fingered hand over the receiver and held it there for a while. He had done what he could. He hoped it would be enough. Back on Earth, their Admiral Vance finally got her secure line to the Prime Minister. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. She spoke plainly, the way she always spoke, without decoration or softening. She told him what she believed needed to happen. She told him what it would cost. She told him what it would mean for Earth's relationship with the rest of the galaxy. He asked her one question: can we do it? She thought about that for 3 seconds. Yes, she said, but they need to understand, completely and permanently, what they did and what we are. There was a pause. Then do it, he said. She closed the channel and looked at the wall of her small office on Titan and thought about 2,400 ships and 300,000 people, and a document that called her species a logistical byproduct. She thought about Captain Holt running his hand along the arm of his chair. She thought about 43 people who died before the first rescue ship arrived. Then she stood up, straightened her uniform, and got to work. The galaxy did not yet know what was coming, but it was coming. Deep below the surface of Mars, in tunnels that had been cut into red rock 3 decades ago and sealed behind bureaucratic language and classification codes that most people in the government had forgotten existed, something old was waking up. The lights came on in sections. First one corridor, then another, and then a whole row of sealed maintenance bays stretching for kilometers under the Martian plains. The air recyclers started. The temperature regulation systems activated. And in the bays themselves, long, wide, cold chambers that had been dark and silent for 29 years. The shapes emerged slowly from the dimness as the lights grew brighter. Warships, old ones, human warships, sitting in dry dock exactly as they had been left, covered in dust that had settled over decades, their hulls dull and still, but intact. Every one of them intact. This was the remnant arsenal. Most people did not know it existed. When Earth had joined the Concordat, the public announcement had been about moving forward, about putting old conflicts behind them, about becoming part of something larger. What the announcement had not mentioned was that the people who built Earth's military were, by nature and training, not the kind of people who destroyed things that still worked. They had mothballed the pre-contact war fleet. They had sealed it away, deep and quiet, and they had maintained it quietly, with skeleton crews who filed their reports under supply depot designations that would bore anyone who glanced at them. The woman who had overseen that maintenance program for the last 18 years was a retired general named Orrin Mast. She was 70 years old, small and compact, with hands that were always moving slightly, the habit of someone who spent their life around machinery. She had known Admiral Vance for 20 years. When Vance's call came through on the emergency line, Hiram Mast had been sitting in her office on Mars reading a technical report. She had picked up the call, listened for 4 minutes without speaking, and then said, "I'll have the first bay open in 3 hours." The process was not simple. 29 years of dormancy meant that nothing worked perfectly at first. Systems had to be tested. Repairs had to be made. Power cores that had been in standby mode for decades needed careful restart procedures that took time and precision. There were 847 ships in the remnant arsenal, ranging from small, fast attack craft to heavy battle cruisers. Some of them needed significant work. None of them were impossible. General Mast had 400 maintenance personnel on the initial crew, and within 48 hours, that number had grown to over 4,000 as Earth's military command authorized a full activation and called in every available engineer, technician, and specialist. They worked in shifts around the clock, eating quick meals at portable stations set up in the corridors, sleeping in short rotations on cots in empty storage bays, filling the tunnels with the noise of tools and machinery and people doing urgent work with focus and purpose. Meanwhile, on Earth's surface, the shipyards were changing. The orbital construction rings above Earth had been building civilian and commercial vessels for most of the last decade. They were large, sophisticated, and capable of extraordinary output when properly directed. They were now being directed. The civilian contracts were suspended. Compensation arrangements made quickly. No arguments from the companies involved, because the people running those companies had all read the same document as everyone else, and there was at that moment no one on Earth who wanted to argue about contract terms. The orbital yards above Europa, one of Jupiter's moons, were even larger and had been semi-dormant. They activated within 72 hours of the Prime Minister's authorization. The Titan shipyards, where Admiral Vance had been working, began producing new escort-class vessels at a pace that their crew chief said was technically impossible, and then kept doing anyway. Humanity, it turned out, was very good at building things quickly when it had a reason. The new fleet needed a name. The Military Planning Committee considered several options. Admiral Vance, who was involved in most of the planning discussions, Henry had no opinion on the name. She had opinions on weapons payloads, engine configurations, formation strategies, and tactical doctrine. She left naming to others. The committee chose the Sovereign Reckoning Armada, and it was a good name, and nobody objected to it. The ships from the remnant arsenal were upgraded as they were repaired. This was the part that surprised people who had not been paying close attention to what Earth's researchers had been doing for the last 30 years. When humanity joined the Concordat, they had access to new technology, Concordat technology, shared through trade and exchange programs. Most of it was good. Some of it was extraordinary. Earth scientists had studied it carefully, absorbed it, combined it with their own approaches, and in many cases improved on it in ways that the original developers had not anticipated. The Concordat's technology-sharing programs were designed to help developing species catch up slightly, not to give them the tools to overtake. They had underestimated human ingenuity. Much of this improved technology had never been shared back with the Concordat. Some of it had been filed in research archives. Some of it existed only in the minds of the engineers and scientists who had developed it. All of it was now being pulled out, assessed, and applied. The new weapon systems were faster and more precise than the standard Concordat designs. The shielding technology had been modified using principles that Earth's physicists had developed independently, producing a layered defense that was more resilient than anything of comparable size. The engines were more efficient. Humanity had spent 2 decades on propulsion research specifically because their ships were always being told they were slower than they needed to be, and Earth's engineers were constitutionally unable to be told something couldn't be done without making it their personal mission to do it. The tactical systems were particularly advanced. Earth's military doctrine had always emphasized adaptability, the ability to change strategy mid-engagement based on conditions on the ground or in space. Human commanders were trained to think quickly and make decisions with incomplete information. Their ships' computer systems were built to support this, giving commanders faster, clearer data with fewer assumptions baked in. Most Concordat warships relied heavily on preset tactical algorithms. As human ships were built around the assumption that the commander would need to improvise. Captain Darren Holt was one of the first recovered crew members to return to active service. He had been found on the 4th day of the rescue operation, aboard the stripped hull of the ESNS Resolve, which had been docked at Selhara and then pushed out into a slow drift when it was emptied. He had kept his crew together through those days with a quietness that his people described, later, as the most frightening kind of calm they had ever seen. He had organized the food rationing precisely. He had kept people busy with small tasks to stop them from sitting with their fear. He had done the math on the air recyclers and told no one except his chief engineer the exact number he got. How? Because the exact number was not helpful information for anyone who could not change it. When the rescue ship found them and the airlock opened, he had stood aside and made sure every member of his crew boarded before him. He was the last one off his ship. He had been in medical care for 12 days. When he was cleared for duty, he walked into Admiral Vance's planning center, a large room that had been set up in the military command complex in Geneva, and stood at attention. "Captain Holt," she said. "Admiral," he said, "do you want to go home and rest? You're authorized." "With respect, Admiral," he said, "I'd like a ship." She looked at him for a moment. "The Resolve is gone." The Concordat stripped her. "Then I'll take another one," he said. She gave him a heavy battle cruiser that had just come out of the Martian repair bays, one newly fitted and upgraded. It was designated the ESNS Consequence. He spent 3 days learning her systems, integrating with her crew, drawn from recovered Iron Covenant veterans and fresh recruits, and then reported ready for deployment. The name of the ship had been his suggestion. Vance had approved it immediately. The Sovereign Reckoning Armada grew ship by ship, week by week, through intensive work and long hours and the peculiar, focused energy of a population that had moved past anger into something more operational. By the 6th week after the document had been released, the fleet counted over 1,800 vessels. A mix of refurbished remnant arsenal ships, newly constructed craft from the orbital yards, and the surviving Iron Covenant ships that had made their way home from the outer systems. And those returning Iron Covenant crews had been given a choice: stand down and rest or return to service. A very large percentage of them chose to return to service. Their reasons were their own, and nobody asked them to explain. Through all of this, the Concordat was not idle. Concordat observers in human space, diplomatic staff, trade representatives, monitoring stations, were sending reports home. The reports were honest and the information was accurate, which meant the security circle was getting a clear picture of what was happening, and the picture was not comfortable. Counselor Dreth Voss called for a special session of the security circle. He proposed a diplomatic outreach to Earth, an offer of negotiation, a suggestion of review processes, a mention of possible compensation. And the proposal was supported by several of the elder race's representatives. It was not supported by the military faction of the security circle, which pointed out, correctly, that Earth had not responded to any Concordat communications in 2 weeks, and that the fleet building in human space had not been built by a civilization planning to negotiate. The diplomatic proposal was drafted anyway and transmitted to Earth on official Concordat channels. Admiral Vance received it, read it, and set it aside. She did not respond. It was not that she felt nothing reading it. She felt quite a lot, actually. Specifically, a cold recognition that the same people who had written the phrase logistical byproduct were now using words like dialogue and mutual understanding and shared future. She filed the message under a folder she had labeled, Chutter, with precise accuracy, too late. She had more important things to do. The tactical planning for the Sovereign Reckoning Armada's operation had been ongoing for 5 weeks. It was not a simple plan. It was not a plan that called for the fleet to fly to the Concordat's home system and start firing in every direction. Vance was not that kind of commander. She had always believed that force, when necessary, needed to be precise and purposeful. You hit what needed to be hit. You did not hit things that didn't need to be hit. And before you hit anything, you knew exactly what you were trying to achieve. The objective was not destruction. The objective was recovery and accountability. First, every remaining stranded crew member in every system was to be found and brought home. And the fleet would move through the outer systems in a systematic sweep, recovering any human military personnel who had not yet been reached by civilian rescue efforts. This was non-negotiable. It was the first thing and the most important thing. Second, the Concordat's military capacity to threaten Earth or Earth's people needed to be reduced, not eliminated, not destroyed entirely, but broken in a way that took years to rebuild. The specific assets targeted were the stations and fleets that had been used to hold the Iron Covenant Armada and the military command infrastructure of the Security Circle's enforcement branch. Third, the Concordat itself needed to face a moment of such clear and undeniable consequence that the question of doing something like this again would become genuinely unthinkable. Vance briefed her senior commanders on this plan in a room in Geneva, on a morning when the sun was coming through the high windows and making long, bright lines across the floor. She spoke for 2 hours. Her commanders, 30 men and women who had between them over 500 years of military experience, listened without interruption. When she finished, she asked for questions. One of the senior commanders, a veteran named General Yusuf Okafor, who had fought in every major conflict Earth had been involved in for 30 years, raised his hand. He was a big man with a careful voice, and he had known Vance since they were both junior officers. "What do we do if they surrender early?" he asked. "We stop," she said simply. "We get what we need. We stop." He nodded. "And what do we need?" "Our people. An accounting. One and a change that lasts." She paused. "We're not building an empire, Yusuf. We're making a point." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Understood." The fleet was ready on the 43rd day, 1,800 ships assembled in formation outside Earth's orbital space, engines ready, weapons armed, crews at their stations. Vance stood on the bridge of the ESNS Consequence, Holt's ship, the flagship she had chosen for the operation, and looked at the fleet spread across the forward displays. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of people, All of them human, all of them there for the same reason. She thought about the long document with the careful bureaucratic language. She thought about the phrase, logistical byproduct. She thought about 43 people who didn't make it to the first rescue ship. "Soy Admiral," said the navigation officer. "Fleet is ready and waiting on your order." She straightened. She had prepared a short address to the fleet. She delivered it plainly without theatrics, because she was not a theatrical person, and the moment did not need decoration. "You know why we're here," she said. "You know what was done. We are going to recover our people, and we are going to make sure that what was done to them can never be done again. We will be precise. We will be controlled. We will not be cruel, because we are not them, but we will be thorough, and we will be clear." Move out. The sovereign reckoning. Armada moved. It moved like a single thing. Vast, coordinated, certain. The stars turned slowly in the forward viewports. Earth and her moons grew small behind them. In the Concordate security circle, the monitoring reports had been coming in all day. When the final report arrived, fleet departing human space, full battle configuration, course set for outer systems, Dreth Voss read it and sat back in his seat and said nothing for a very long time. Someone beside him asked what they should do. He did not answer immediately. He was thinking about something a junior analyst had put in an appendix to one of the early reports. A note about human behavior under pressure. The analyst had written that humans, unlike most species, did not become disorganized when they were angry. They became focused. They became organized. They became, in the analyst's careful words, extraordinarily purposeful. The fleet was moving. What had been done could not be undone. The Concordate was about to find out what happened next. And the first system the Sovereign Reckoning Armada entered was called Vetheran. It was an unremarkable system. 3 planets, 1 small Concordate relay station, and the scattered remains of what had once been an outer colony refueling post. The reason the fleet went there first was simple. A distress signal, very faint, had been traced to the system 4 days earlier. A single Iron Covenant ship, a light scout vessel called the ESNS Patient Star, had been drifting there for 31 days with 17 people aboard and no working engines. When the Sovereign Reckoning Armada dropped out of transit speed at the edge of the system, the relay station immediately hailed them on Concordat emergency frequency and demanded identification. And the station commander's voice was clipped and formal and carried the automatic authority of someone who had never been spoken to by someone who didn't recognize that authority. Lieutenant Commander Prell, Vance's aide now serving as communications officer aboard the flagship, replied. He gave the fleet's designation, Earth's authorization codes, and the purpose of their presence in the system. He was polite, he was clear. He said they were there to recover stranded Earth military personnel, and that no Concordate assets would be interfered with, provided no Concordate personnel interfered with the recovery operation. The station commander told him they were in violation of Concordate territorial jurisdiction and ordered them to stand down and await official instruction. Prell looked at Admiral Vance. She said nothing. She simply looked at the forward display, where the sensor readout showed the faint energy signature of a drifting ship 300,000 kilometers from their position. Prell turned back to the console. "We are proceeding with the recovery," he said. "You are welcome to file a jurisdictional complaint with Earth's diplomatic office. The contact address is available through the standard Concordate registry." He closed the channel. 2 medical ships and an escort of 6 destroyers broke from the main fleet and moved toward the Patient Star at full speed. They found her adrift and cold. Her crew had been rationing power with extreme discipline, shutting down everything that was not immediately necessary for survival. When the airlock opened and rescue personnel came through, the 17 people inside were thin and exhausted and very quiet. One of them, a young woman named Ensign Taylor Marsh, who had been on her first deep space assignment when the Armada was handed over, shook hands with the rescue officer and then sat down on the floor of the airlock and didn't get up for a while. Not because she was hurt, just because she had been holding herself very straight for 31 days and her body had decided it was allowed to stop now. The Concordate station did not interfere. The fleet moved on. System by system, the Sovereign Reckoning Armada swept through the regions where the Iron Covenant Armada had been abandoned. At every stop, the process was the same. locate, approach, recover. The fleet moved with speed and precision, never staying longer than necessary, when never engaging any local concordate presence unless directly obstructed. In 3 systems, small concordate patrol fleets moved to intercept. In all 3 cases, the human fleet's response was the same. It continued toward its objective and made clear, through position and formation rather than words, that stopping it was possible only through actual combat, and that the patrol fleet in question should consider whether it wanted to start that. None of the 3 patrol fleets started it. The crew recovering went faster than even Vance had projected. The reasons for this were partly the fleet's speed and partly the fact that human rescue crews had been operating in the outer systems for weeks already through civilian channels, and the military fleet was building on that groundwork. By the 12th day, 640 recovered crew members had been brought aboard fleet support ships, given medical care, and reintegrated. Many of them, once cleared by the medical staff, asked for assignments. Vance had expected this. She had prepared for it. Ships that had been held in reserve were brought forward. Recovered veterans were given crews and positions. The fleet grew as it moved, which was not something most military strategists would have put in a plan, but which Vance had counted on because she knew her people. By the time the fleet completed its recovery sweep and turned toward Concordat core space, it had grown from 1,800 ships to over 2,400, a number not coincidental to anyone who was counting. The galaxy had been watching. This was in some ways the thing the Concordat had most underestimated. And the Concordat was old and powerful and used to being watched. They were not used to being watched by everyone simultaneously, including the species they had kept small and manageable for centuries. The document leak had spread everywhere, and the response to it had spread further. Species that had been members of the Concordat for generations, species that had quietly accepted their limited status and their ceremonial votes and their carefully maintained inability to challenge the elder races, were looking at a fleet of 2,400 human ships moving through Concordat space and thinking things they had not let themselves think in a very long time. The Volhari were the first to act. Ketharon had not been idle since he sent the document to Vance. He had, in fact, been working in the background with a focused energy that surprised even his own people. He had contacted the Volhari Home Council. He had shared what he knew. He had made arguments in quiet rooms with careful words and had, over the course of several weeks, managed to shift a consensus that had been leaning toward cautious neutrality into something more definitive. The Volhari formally withdrew from the Concordat on the 14th day of the fleet's operation. Their statement was brief and factual. They cited the content of the leaked document, the treatment of Earth's military personnel, and the Concordat's long-standing pattern of using its structure to limit rather than support the development of smaller species. They offered Earth navigational data for Concordat space, sensor maps, transit routes, audio patrol schedules that had been available to them through their trade relationships over many years. The Concordat security circle's response to the Volhari withdrawal was by all accounts extremely sharp. But sharp words from powerful people at a meeting table are not warships, and warships were what mattered at this point. 2 other species, the Nethoran, a small but technologically sophisticated people from the Mid-Rim, and the Caress, a ocean world species who had been associate members for 80 years, followed the Volhari within a week. They did not offer Earth military support. They offered something in some ways more useful. They publicly confirmed, with their own archived evidence, that the Concordat's security circle had used similar tactics against their own development programs decades earlier. And they hadn't had an Iron Covenant armada to lose, so the damage had been quieter and slower. But the pattern was the same. The galaxy was watching all of this. Every species was calculating. The Concordat's military command assembled its fleet response at the Orith Nebula. The Orith Nebula was a natural feature, a wide cloud of ionized gas and dust that stretched across the approach to the Concordat's 3 core systems. It was the traditional defense position for the inner systems. Fleets that gathered at Orith were saying, clearly, that the core systems were behind them and were not going to be reached easily. The Concordat fleet that gathered there was large. It was the largest assembly of Concordat military vessels in recorded history. Warships from over 40 member species, pulled from patrol duties and border assignments and reserve positions. The fleet's analysts had looked at the Sovereign Reckoning Armada's specifications, based on the monitoring reports from human space, and had made assessments and adjustments. They had brought long-range weapons platforms, heavy cruisers, and layered defensive formations. They had planned for the kind of battle that should, on paper, stop a fleet the size of humanity's. On paper. The problem with the paper was that it was based on data the Concordat had about human military capability as of 30 years ago, supplemented by observations of the Iron Covenant Armada, the fleet they had taken. They knew that fleet well. They had taken it apart piece by piece. They knew its weapons, its armor, its tactics, its training. They had built their defensive plan around it. They did not know the Sovereign Reckoning Armada. They did not know what Earth's engineers had done in 3 decades of quiet research. They did not know the modifications on the remnant arsenal ships. They did not know the new weapon systems, or the improved shields, or the engine upgrades. And they absolutely did not know the tactics. Admiral Vance had spent 30 years studying the Concordat's military, not because she expected this fight, though a part of her, the careful, cold part that had made her uneasy at that signing ceremony, had never entirely stopped preparing for it. She had studied because military people study their environment, and the Concordat was her environment, and she was thorough. She had the engagement records of every major battle the Concordat had fought in the last 2 centuries. She had the tactical doctrines of every senior species military forces. She knew how they moved, how they communicated, how they made decisions under pressure, where their formations weakened, which command structures were rigid and which were adaptive. She knew specifically that the Concordat fleet fought according to preset battle plans. Their commanders were skilled, but they operated within defined parameters. They expected opponents to behave predictably. They were very good at responding to predictable opponents. She had no intention of being predictable. When the Sovereign Reckoning Armada reached the Orith Nebula and saw the Concordat fleet waiting on the other side, dense, ordered, enormous, she split her fleet into 7 independently operating groups, each with its own command and objectives, and gave each group commander 2 simple instructions: complete your objective and adapt. The Concordat's defense algorithms, watching the human fleet approach, expected a frontal engagement. They prepared for it with careful, practiced order. What they got was 11 hours of the most confusing and exhausting battle any of their commanders had experienced. The 7 human fleet groups did not move together. They moved at different speeds on different vectors, creating engagement situations that the Concordat's tactical systems kept classifying as new problems rather than variations on existing ones. Ships that took damage dropped back and were replaced by reserves that had been held specifically for this purpose. Formations that looked like attacks turned out to be feints. Feints that looked like retreats turned into flanking runs. A Concordat commanders who expected opponents to become less effective as a battle progressed found that human units seemed to become more effective under pressure, adapting their approach based on what was in front of them rather than what the plan said should be in front of them. Captains who lost their original objectives improvised new ones. Crew members who had been stranded for weeks in dying ships and had spent every day since returning to service waiting for this fight brought to it a kind of personal intensity that was not easy to counter with algorithms. In the 4th hour, a Concordat heavy cruiser group that had been the center of their defensive line was outmaneuvered by a human destroyer squadron that should not, by any reasonable calculation, have been in that position. The cruisers had to reposition, which opened a gap in the line, which 3 human battle cruisers went through before the gap could be closed. In the 7th hour, the Concordat's long-range weapons platforms, which had been the cornerstone of their initial planning, found themselves being engaged at close range, not because human ships had broken through their defensive perimeter, but because 3 of those 7 independently operating human groups had been moving, very slowly and through the outer edges of the nebula itself, since the 2nd hour, using the ionized gas as sensor cover, and had arrived in the platform's blind spots without the tracking systems noticing until it was too late. In the 9th hour, the Concordat fleet's left formation broke. It happened quickly once it started. Ships began pulling back from positions that had become untenable. Other ships, seeing their neighbors pull back, had to adjust or become isolated. The careful, pre-planned defensive structure that had looked so solid from the outside developed fractures, and then those fractures became breaks, and then it was not a planned defense anymore. It was a series of individual ships making individual decisions, and individual ships making individual decisions is the kind of situation that fleet commanders have nightmares about. By the 11th hour, the Concordate fleet had withdrawn past the Oreth Nebula and was reforming in the space before the inner systems, taking stock of itself and its losses. It was not destroyed. Vance had not tried to destroy it. She had tried to break it, and break it she had. And she had brought her fleet through the nebula with losses. Real people. And she felt each one of them as she received the damage reports. But the fleet was intact and moving, and the path to the Concordate's core systems was open. Captain Holt, on the bridge of the ES&S Consequence, looked at the clearing space ahead and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly to his navigation officer, "Set course for the Concordate home system." The navigation officer set the course. The Sovereign Reckoning Armada moved through the Orath Nebula like something inevitable. Behind them, in a dozen systems, the news was already spreading. Alien news services that had been covering the conflict from a cautious distance now covered it plainly. The Concordate fleet had been beaten. The human fleet was at the door, and species across the galaxy, small ones, mid-sized ones that had been told for a century that their role was to participate but not to lead, to contribute but not to challenge, were watching with an attention that was no longer cautious. It was something closer to hope. Aboard the flagship, Vance sat in the command chair and reviewed the damage reports and the status reports and the list of the people who had not come through the Orath engagement. She sat with that list for a long time before she moved on to the next item. Then she began preparing what she was going to say when she reached the Concordate's home system. Because arriving was not the point. What she said when she arrived was the point. The battle had been necessary. What came after the battle was what actually mattered. She started writing. The Concordate's homeworld was called Vel-Shar. It was a beautiful planet, old and layered with the accumulated architecture of 5 centuries of interstellar power. Its cities rose in long, curving towers that caught the light of its sun and scattered it in colors that didn't have good names in human languages. Its orbital space was full of stations and rings and the slow movement of ships that had been moving in those same patterns for so long that they had become like the breathing of a sleeping body. Automatic, unconscious, unquestioned. Nobody had questioned it in a very long time. The Sovereign Reckoning Armada arrived at the outer edge of Vel-Shar's system at mid-morning by the planet's local time cycle, which meant that the people on the surface who were awake and at their windows or their screens had clear visibility of what was happening above them. And they watched the human fleet emerge from transit, ship after ship after ship, spreading across the far orbital bands in a formation that their news commentators struggled to find words for. One commentator, an elderly Velhari academic who had been covering Concordate affairs for 40 years, eventually settled on the word architectural and went quiet for a while after that. The fleet did not fire. It took position in high orbit, far enough to be unthreatening to the civilian infrastructure, close enough for everyone on the planet below to look up and understand the situation clearly. The Concordate's home defense fleet, smaller than the force at Arath and visibly shaken by the reports coming from the Nebula engagement, held position between the human fleet and the planet. They did not advance. They were a presence, not an action. Admiral Vance opened a broadcast channel. She had prepared what she was going to say carefully over the last few days of travel. She had written and rewritten it. She had wanted it to be honest and clear and not cruel, because she was not interested in cruelty and because cruelty, in her experience, made enemies more stubborn rather than less. She wanted to be understood, not merely feared. She opened the channel on a frequency that would reach every receiver in the Concordate's home system, civilian, military, diplomatic, all of them. And she spoke. She spoke for 40 minutes. She began with the facts, not her version of the facts, the actual facts, the documented record, supported by the same materials that had already been made public but presented now in sequence, methodically, and so that no one listening could say they hadn't understood. She went through the disarmament accord, The language that had been hidden in the fine print, the security circle document with its careful descriptions of humanity as a stability risk and her soldiers as logistical byproduct. She named the systems where crews had been abandoned. She named the number of dead. She named the date of the first signal from the cargo hauler who found 9 hollow ships in the dark. And she gave the name of the young ensign who had sat down on the floor of an airlock after 31 days because her body had finally been allowed to stop holding itself upright. She said all of this plainly and without decoration. Then she moved to what the Concordat was. She did not say the Concordat was evil. She did not call its member species villains or monsters. She said the Concordat was a structure that had been built over centuries in a way that served the interests of the species who built it at the expense of the species who came after. She said that structure had been working as intended when it did what it did to Earth, and that the problem was therefore not just the specific act, but the system that made the act possible and logical and, from the inside, reasonable. She said that she had reviewed the records that the Nethoran in the Caress had released, and that the same logic had been applied to them before Earth was even a spacefaring species, and that there were probably others whose cases had not yet come to light. She said this was not a sustainable arrangement for anyone, including the elder races, who were building a galaxy full of resentment on a foundation they believed was stability. Then she said what she wanted. She said the Concordat needed to be dissolved in its current form. She said a new governing body needed to take its place, one with equal representation for every member species, without permanent vetoes, without a security circle that operated in secret, and without the institutional habit of deciding what other species were allowed to become. She proposed calling it the Galactic Assembly of Sovereign Peoples. She had a draft charter ready for distribution. She had been working on it since before the fleet left Earth. She said Earth would not lead this new assembly. She said Earth was not interested in becoming what the Concordat had been. She said humanity had learned at considerable cost what it felt like to be managed by people who thought they knew best and that they were not willing to do that to others. She said she would wait 72 hours for the Concordat security circle to respond. She said that if no response came, the fleet would begin targeted operations against the Concordat's military command infrastructure. Not the civilian population, not the cities, not the stations that served the people of El-Shar, but the specific assets and facilities that had been used to plan and execute what was done to Earth's people. She named these assets specifically. She had done her research. She closed the channel. The silence that followed on the bridge of the ESNS Consequence lasted about 4 seconds. Then Captain Holt, who had been standing slightly to her left throughout the broadcast, he said very quietly, "That was well said, Admiral." She looked at him. "Let's hope it works," she said. On Velshar's surface, in the Grand Assembly Hall where she had sat 30 years ago at the start of this story, the Concordat Security Circle convened within the hour. They were 12 individuals representing the foremost senior species in the Concordat. They had spent 5 centuries being the people who made decisions about the galaxy. They sat in their high seats and looked at the broadcast recording and at each other and at the sensor feeds showing 2,400 human warships in orbit above their homeworld. The conversation was not the kind that got summarized easily in diplomatic language. Drethvas had aged visibly in the past weeks. He sat at the head of the table and listened to his colleagues speak in turn and said little. He was thinking about the woman on the broadcast. He was thinking about her 40 minutes of clear, documented, carefully structured argument, delivered from the flagship of a fleet that had beaten the largest military response the Concordat had mounted in living memory. He was thinking about the fact that she had not demanded surrender. She had not threatened mass destruction. She had proposed a charter. The military faction of the security circle argued for resistance. They said giving in to a single species with a fleet, however large, would set a precedent that every discontented species in the galaxy would learn from. They said strength required demonstration. Drethvas listened to them argue for 2 hours. Then he said, "The demonstration has already been made. So the question is whether we are going to add to the cost." He looked around the table. He looked at faces he had known for decades, faces that had always projected certainty and calm, faces that were doing their best to project those things now and not quite managing it. "She is correct about what we built," he said. I have known it for a long time. I chose, as we all did, not to say so. That was a mistake for which we will spend a very long time making amends." He paused. "But making amends is possible. The alternative she is offering us is not defeat. It is change." Another pause, longer. "I would rather choose change than have it chosen for us." The vote was not unanimous, but it had the necessary support. The dissolution accord was signed 5 hours and 40 minutes after Vance's broadcast. She received the formal notification on the bridge of the consequence and read it, and then put it down and looked at the planet below through the forward viewport for a while. It was a beautiful planet. She had said what she came to say. The fleet around her, vast and silent in the orbital dark, held its positions and waited. She sent a single message to Earth. It said, "It's done." The reply came back in minutes, and it was not official or formal. It was from the Prime Minister's personal line, and it said 3 words. "Come home, Sarah." The process of actually building what she had proposed took considerably longer than 40 minutes. The Galactic Assembly of Sovereign Peoples was not a simple structure to create. 47 species needed to agree on foundational principles. And the charter that Vance had drafted, in the hours between battles and briefings, on the flagship of a war fleet, was a starting point, not an end point. It needed revision, debate, amendment, and compromise from people and species who were not always inclined toward any of those things. Earth's diplomatic team returned to the negotiating table, led not by an ambassador this time, but by a committee of 7 people from different backgrounds: lawyers, scientists, former military, trade economists, and one historian whose sole job was to make sure the new structure didn't quietly rebuild the patterns of the old one over time. Keth Aaron of the Volhari joined the drafting process as a formal representative of his people. The Nethoran sent 2 delegates who had opinions on everything and were correct often enough to be worth listening to. The Concordate's elder species participated. They had to. The alternative was exclusion, and exclusion from a structure that was going to govern the galaxy whether they were in it or not was not a useful position for anyone. Dreth Vas himself participated in several sessions. He was not warm or friendly about it, but he was thorough and he was honest. And in the specific context of rewriting the rules of galactic governance, thorough and honest were more useful than warm. The charter was finalized and ratified 11 months after the battle at Orath Nebula. The first session of the Galactic Assembly of Sovereign Peoples was held in a new building, not the old Concordate chamber, not the enormous dark glass hall designed to make everyone feel small. The new assembly hall was lower and wider, and with large windows on every side letting in natural light, and seats arranged in a circle so that no one sat above anyone else. It held representatives from 63 species at its first session, with more expected to join as the ratification process continued. It was contentious from the first meeting. People disagreed loudly and often. Species with very different needs and values and histories tried to find common ground on questions that did not have easy answers. Votes were close. Debates ran long. Several sessions ended without resolution and had to be reconvened. This was, Vance thought, when she read the reports, exactly what good governance looked like. She was not in the assembly. She had given her input to the charter process and then stepped back from it. Someone because the charter was a document of law and she was a military officer and the 2 roles needed to stay separated. She went back to Earth after the signing of the dissolution accord, and she went back to her work, which was managing Earth's military in a galaxy that was rapidly changing shape. Earth maintained its fleet. There had been quiet pressure from some quarters, mostly from species who had watched the battle at Orath with a mixture of relief and unease, to suggest that Earth might demonstrate good faith by reducing its military capacity now that the conflict was resolved. These suggestions were received politely and ignored completely. Vance had written the response herself, though the Prime Minister had delivered it. The response said, in diplomatic language, that Earth's military capacity was Earth's business, and in that the galaxy was welcome to demonstrate good faith by not making it necessary again. Nobody pressed the point further. Captain Holt returned to active command after 3 months of leave that he spent, for the most part, in a small house near the coast of a large ocean on Earth. He walked on the beach every day. He read books. He learned slowly to sleep without waking every hour to check that the air recyclers were still running. After the 3 months, he came back and was given command of a new ship, a new construction, larger than the Consequence, built in the Europa yards. He named her the ESNS Patient Star, after the scout ship and the 17 people who had held on for 31 days. Ensign Tila Marsh, who had sat down on the airlock floor when rescue finally came, applied for officer training when she recovered, because she was accepted. She was, by all reports, exceptionally good at her work, with a particular talent for keeping her people steady under pressure. No one who knew her history found this surprising. General Orrin Mast retired from the Remnant Arsenal program, which was now formally acknowledged, no longer filed under boring bureaucratic cover names, and was given a commendation that she accepted briefly and then put in a drawer. She had never been interested in ceremonies. She was interested in machinery. Ketharan became the Volhari's first permanent representative to the Galactic Assembly. He was a good diplomat, direct, careful, and able to say things that made powerful people uncomfortable without making them angry. He and Vance exchanged occasional messages over the years that followed. They were brief messages. They're usually about practical matters, fleet positioning, assembly developments, trade route concerns. Occasionally one of them would note something that was going well or something that wasn't. They were not friends exactly, but they were something, and it was a thing that had been built from honesty in a difficult time, which is the most durable kind. Admiral Vance herself continued as Earth's Chief of Defense for 6 more years before stepping back to an advisory role. She was offered a seat in the Assembly as a special representative and declined it. She was offered several other things and declined most of them. What she accepted was a standing office with good communications access and a staff of 6 people from which she read reports and wrote assessments and occasionally, when asked, he offered opinions that people tended to take seriously. She was 57 years old when she stepped back from active command. She had served for 34 years. She had done things she was proud of and things she would always regret and things she had not been able to avoid regardless of what she felt about them. She sat in her office and looked at a view of the planet below through a high window and thought about all of it more than she told anyone. The galaxy that existed 11 months after the battle at Orath was not a perfect galaxy. It was not peaceful in every corner or just in every system. The Galactic Assembly argued and stalled and sometimes failed to act when it should have. Old resentments between species did not dissolve because the structure above them had changed. Problems that had been building for centuries did not resolve in less than a year, but it was a different galaxy. That was real and measurable. Species that had been limited by the old Concordat structure were growing now, cautiously, tentatively, with the particular care of people who had been told for a long time what they couldn't do and were still relearning that they could. The Assembly, for all its messiness, held. The equal vote structure meant that the elder races had to make arguments rather than simply issuing decisions. Making arguments meant justifying things that had previously never needed justification. Justifying things led slowly to examining them, and examining them led sometimes to changing them. It was slow, it was uncertain, it was the right direction. And through all of it, in the orbital space around Earth and her colonies and her outer stations, the fleet held its positions. Not aggressive, not expanding, not pointed at any particular target. Just there, maintaining, training, ready. There was a phrase that became common in diplomatic circles in the years that followed the Orath battle. It was used when a proposal was made in the Assembly that a powerful species didn't like, or when a decision was being pushed through too fast, or when someone tested the edges of what the new charter permitted. Someone would say, usually quietly, usually without emphasis, "The humans are watching." It was never said as a threat, it was said as a fact, and it was always enough. Because the galaxy remembered, in the way that galaxies remember things that happen fast and matter completely, what had happened when people forgot that humanity was paying attention. It remembered a fleet that came out of the dark, built from ships that should have been forgotten, crewed by people who had been left to die and had decided not to. It remembered that humans did not stop, that they adapted and persisted and planned and came, in the end, with more ships than anyone had accounted for, and a charter drafted on a warship between battles. It remembered that they had won and then had chosen, deliberately, not to become what they defeated. That was the part that stuck, the part that was hardest to dismiss, the part that lingered in the reports of diplomatic analysts and the personal journals of assembly representatives, and the late-night conversations of species who were still figuring out what the new shape of the galaxy meant for them. They had won, and they had stopped, not because they couldn't have taken more. Everyone who had been at Orath knew they could have taken more.